of the I can't go into the detailed figures of what those exact figures would be. We are in negotiations with a successful tenderer at the moment. Once there is financial closure on the project, all the figures have been made available for public comment, for public scrutiny. Right, so I can't go into exactly what the figures are.
But during the election campaign, the government said it would cost $1.7 billion, and the government still maintains it would cost $1.7 billion to build.
Well, what I can say is that there's been no blowout in the construction costs as has been claimed by the Liberal Party.
Right, but this document from Macquarie Bank, which has been sent around to the media, including the ABC, details a series of other costs. So it says construction expenditure $1.781 billion, but then there's financing costs of close to $700 million, and then there are other costs which take you to a total of just over $2.7 billion. Does that sound about right?
Well, I'm not going to comment.
I'm not asking you to confirm whether these figures are exact, but I'm just saying, for taxpayers who are listening right now, is it reasonable for them to say, oh yeah, that sounds about right, $2.7 billion?
Well, what I can say is this, David. You have, with any infrastructure project, whether it be a school or a hospital or a new road, whether it be the duplication of the Southern Expressway or whether it be the electrification of the railways, you obviously have your construction costs, and when the government talks about the cost of a project, that's what it's talking about, it's construction costs. But of course, they're not the only costs associated with a project. If you're borrowing to finance the project, you've got your debt, you've got the cost of undertaking the borrowings, you've got the cost of the infrastructure over its lifetime.
Yes, but during the election campaign, Jim Katsaris from the Save the RAH party had this to say. He was putting together a whole lot of stuff, and he was saying, you know what, this project's going to cost more than $2 billion. Let's go back just over a year ago to what Jim Katsaris was telling our listeners.
Now, Jack Snelling, that's Jim Katsaris, who's obviously a senior doctor at the existing Royal Adelaide Hospital, was the face of the no vote, I suppose, before the election. He's almost spot on the money, according to I mean, this is his figures, give or take, a little margin, are almost exactly what one of the major investors in this project, Macquarie Private Bank, is telling its investors.
If you're making a comparison between what it would cost the government to build this hospital itself and borrow the money, and compare that to the way we've chosen to do it, which is a PPP, you have to look not just at the construction costs of building it, but also the risks that go along with undertaking...
So Jim Katsaris was on the money, was he not?
Well, just let me
He's basically saying what you're saying to us this morning.
Just let me finish. The risks associated with the construction of that project, which on a project of this complexity are substantial, but also the fact that what the government is purchasing through the PPP on behalf of taxpayers is not just a hospital, but a hospital which will be maintained over 35 years, a hospital which will include all the non-clinical services, so the cleaning, the maintenance, all those other things that go along with the hospital, which is with the cost of which is substantial. And at the end of the 35 years, giving back to South Australian taxpayers a hospital which is at contemporary standards. So if you want to make a comparison, but if you want to, can I just finish? If you want to make a comparison between what this project would have cost if we had done it as a traditional government build as opposed to a PPP, you have to take into account all those other factors.
But during the election campaign, Jim Katsara said, look, this is going to cost more than 1.7. That's your construction cost, then you've got the cost of financing it, and you've got a reasonable return on your money. You've got interest rates that will be paid at the private sector rates, and you've got a reasonable profit to be made. You add all of that up together, you come to around, he said, maybe 2.4 billion. Now, Macquarie Bank have done it. They've come up with 2.7 billion. He said 12 months ago, just over a year ago, he said, if you look at the annual cost, it's going to be between $300 and $400 million. That's what Macquarie Bank is saying. Just putting to you that Jim Katsaros was giving people a fairly accurate idea of what a PPP would cost. Is that fair?
Well, I'm not going to go into what those figures are and whether those figures
No,
are accurate or not.
But he had a good handle on it, did he not?
I simply can't do
No, but did he not have a good handle on the fact that you can't just look at the construction costs if you go down this route? And that's the message he was putting out. You can't just look at the bare construction costs. There are other components, and they can be expensive.
And the government's never made a secret of that.
Well, this is what Kevin Foley had to say immediately after Jim Katsaros spoke to our listeners.
King.
Jack Snelling, it sounds as though Jim Katsaros had a better handle on this than Kevin Foley.
No, not at all. I think what Kevin's saying is absolutely correct, and that is to suggest that the total cost of financing this project, the interest cost on financing this project would be, I think it was 18% figure that Dr. Katsaros is quoting, isn't correct.
Well, the Macquarie Bank document shows that it could be up to 15%.
What the Macquarie Bank are after is people who are wishing to be equity investors in the project. Now, equity investors in any PP project form a small part of the financing of the project.
They're not going to give them a bum steer, though, because that would be illegal, wouldn't it?
No, they're not. But equity investors, or in any PPP project, comprise a small component of the total financing of the project. And because they're equity investors and because they are liable or exposed to greater risk, they can expect a higher return on what they invest in the project. But that only comprises a very small proportion of the total financing of the project, not the entire cost of the project.
So it'll be nowhere near 15. It'll be nowhere near 15%. You're saying
on the entire cost of the project, of course.
And it'll be nowhere near $330 million a year in service payments to pay the consortium.
Well, I'm not going to go into the figures, Matthew, but what I'm saying is that when you're purchasing when you're financing when you pay the service fee that the government will pay over the lifetime of the project won't just be for the construction cost. It'll be for the ongoing maintenance of the hospital. It'll be for all the non-clinical services associated with the hospital, be for the depreciation on the hospital. It'll be for the financing of the hospital. And at the end of the 35 years, when the consortium hands the hospital back to South Australian taxpayers, they will hand back a hospital which is at contemporary standards. So the government is absolutely committed and convinced that the PPP offers best value of money to South Australian taxpayers over the life of the assets.
This is Treasurer Jack Snelling in our studios here on 891 ABC Breakfast with Matthew Abraham and David Bevan.
For $300 to $400 million a year, you could build yourself a small hospital, could you? A regional hospital.
A year?
A year. Every year. You could build yourself a new hospital.
Well, we could, but regional hospitals aren't going to provide the sort of services which South Australians need. I mean, you've got to take into account. I don't think you're taking into account the fact that the hundreds of millions of dollars that it costs to run the existing RAH are costs which are no longer going to be borne. They're going to be transferred over to the new hospitals. So if you talk, that figure that you're talking about, if it was accurate, I'm not saying whether it was, you've got to remember that coming off that is the existing cost of running the existing hospital.
Now, Treasurer Jack Snelling, we do appreciate you coming to the studio. Finally, we've had a number of people now saying that now that the no vote has been defeated by SACA, that the stadium will go ahead and you have to sit down and start working this out. And the government has said that that's a total limit of $535 million is a total exposure from the state government. How are you going to get that money? Will that all be borrowed? And what are the servicing costs of that?
Oh, well, the government will go out and raise it in the normal way that it raises debt. So, yes, it will be all borrowed. Borrowed as a component of the government's total borrowings, which it does every year. Whenever it's got to finance a project, and it'll be at the normal government rate. If
we've been told, look, the risk here, once the government builds the thing, so it then has to pay the debt off. They're going to be able to do that. That's what governments do, okay, eventually. The risk, though, for running the stadium, if it turns out to be a dud, if one of the sporting clubs goes bust, for instance, like the Power, then the risk isn't carried by the taxpayer, it's carried by the sporting codes. Is that your understanding?
Well, the Stadium Management Authority manages the asset and gets all the revenues, but I can't imagine any circumstances where they could possibly go under.
Well, you remember the High Marsh Soccer Stadium and the huge row over that? That was built by the government.
Yeah.
The soccer club was meant to pay for it. It couldn't. And the government had to then take on the liability of the stadium and make it work.
Talking about, Matthew, the Adelaide Pros and the Port Power football and international cricket being played at that stadium.
No, I'm just saying.
I don't think you're really comparing like with like.
Well, SACA managed to get itself into $100 million worth of debt. That's why they came along and liked this deal. They get themselves into debt.
The Power have had to be bailed out by the AFL.
The debt that it incurred was through building a brand new grandstand on the western side of the oval. That's where it incurred its debt.
Well, the Power have got itself into financial trouble.
I'm
just asking about.
You may as well say, well, what if a comet hit the Adelaide Oval? These sort of things are pretty unlikely to happen. In any case, the Stadium Management Authority is not a government entity. It's an incorporation of the SANFL and of the SACA. They carry any financial risk. Now, I guess if for some reason they went under, then the government of the day would have to make a decision about what it wanted to do. The same as it would have to with any organisation of significance to South Australians that was in financial trouble. The government of the day would have to make an assessment. But there's a big difference between that and the government being exposed and being liable for any debts they incur.
Because a comet hit the State Bank, didn't it?
Come on, Matthew.
Well, the State Bank, we've had Mike Rann praising Tim Marcus Clark in Parliament, John Bannon. It was a powerhouse, an engine. It was a symbol of this state being a go-ahead state and not locked in the past. I'm just saying a comet hit the State Bank. That's why we asked these questions.
The Stadium Management Authority is not undertaking the sort of risky financial transactions which the State Bank was engaged in.
Under a Labor government.
Completely different circumstances.
It'd be a lot better run.
Completely different organisations.
But didn't we learn the lesson that we would never again in this state set up an organisation which would conduct activities making the state ultimately liable, over which the state has no control? You don't have any board members on the SMA, do you?
We don't have any board members on any number of organisations which are important to the state and which, if they came into some financial trouble, the state might want to step in and bail them out. That doesn't mean the state's in any way exposed. The state, if the SMA came into financial trouble, and I'm saying that I just cannot imagine any circumstances where that could be possible, but if they did, the government would have no exposure whatsoever. The government may make a decision that they would have to bail them out. But that would be entirely a matter for the government of the day whether they wanted to do that exactly the same as any other organisation that which has important significance to the state.
Jack Snelling, thank you for coming into our studios.
My pleasure, gentlemen.